My cousin handed me a $20 bill at my own wedding reception and told me to make sure the real guests' cars were parked up front. He didn't realize that the ink on the deed for the entire 500-acre mountain resort was still fresh from my morning signature. I folded the bill neatly into my pocket and thanked him for his generosity. The air at the summit of the Blue Ridge crest is thin, crisp, and smells perpetually of damp pine and wood smoke. It is a scent that most people associate with luxury, with escape, with the kind of stillness that money is supposed to buy. For me, it was simply the atmosphere of my workplace and, as of 6 o'clock that morning, the atmosphere of my legacy. I stood on the veranda of the Overlook Lodge, watching the fog roll through the valley like a slow-motion tidal wave. My suit was charcoal gray, well-tailored, but intentionally nondescript. Beside me, my bride, Sarah, wore a dress of simple cream silk. We had wanted a quiet ceremony, a humble beginning, as my cousin Julian liked to call it. Julian arrived 40 minutes late, the roar of his Italian sports car cutting through the mountain silence like a jagged blade. He didn't apologize. He never apologized. Julian was a man who lived in the assertive present, convinced that the world's clock only started ticking when he entered a room. He climbed out of the car, adjusting his sunglasses, a designer pair that costs more than most people's monthly mortgage, scanned the modus gathering with a look of practiced, polite pity. "Alexander, old man," he said, stepping onto the wood-planked porch. He didn't hug me. He reached out and adjusted my tie, his fingers lingering just a second too long, a subtle gesture of correction he had used since we were boys. It's cozy, really, very rustic. It takes a certain kind of courage to go this minimal in a place that practically screams for grandeur. He had a behavioral signature, a verbal tick that functioned as a psychological anchor for his dominance. Every time he finished an observation that was meant to diminish me, he would tilt his head slightly to the left and tap his signet ring against whatever surface was nearby. "The staff seems a bit thin, doesn't it?" he asked, looking past me toward the small catering team setting up the ordeal. "I tried to call the manager to see if we could upgrade your package as a wedding gift to you. No. Add some proper champagne, maybe get some decent linens, but they told me the owner had issued strict instructions that today was a private event. Quite mysterious. Probably just a way to hide the fact that they're understaffed." The gold ring hit the cedar railing. I watched him. I didn't defend the choice of linens. I didn't tell him that the private event was at my direct command. I simply observed the way his eyes darted around, looking for the flaws he needed to find in order to feel superior. He was a man who couldn't enjoy a view unless he felt he was standing on someone else's shoulders to see it. "It suits us, Julian," I said softly. My voice was calm, a steady lake compared to his choppy sea. "We weren't looking for grandeur. We were looking for peace." "Peace," Julian chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "Peace is what people settle for when they can't afford a spectacle. But don't worry. I've already told the family we host the real celebration at my place in the Hamptons next month. We'll get you into a proper tuxedo, something that doesn't look like it was bought off a rack in a department store." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for Sarah to hear. "I know things have been tight for you since the firm went under, Alex. No shame in it. But really, dragging everyone up to a mid-tier hiking resort for a destination wedding, it's a bit of a stretch for the brand, don't you think?" Sarah's hand tightened on my arm. I felt the heat of her indignation, the silent spark of a woman who knew the truth, but was waiting for my lead. I patted her hand gently. I was a man of long memory and even longer patience. I had spent 3 years liquidating my offshore holdings, moving in the silence of shell companies and private equity, all to acquire this specific mountain. Julian thought I was a failed consultant living on savings. He saw the humble wedding as proof of my decline. The reception was held in the lodge's smaller dining room. We had kept the guest list to 20 people, true friends, the kind who didn't care about the thread count of the napkins. Julian, however, treated the event like a site inspection. He wandered from table to table, making suggestions to the waitstaff, complaining about the vintage of the wine, and ensuring everyone knew that he was staying in the presidential suite room he had booked months ago, unaware that his host was the man he was currently mocking. "You know, Alexander," Julian said, standing during the toasts. He didn't wait to be invited to speak. He simply stood and commanded the air. "There's a lesson here. Life is about tiers. Some people are meant for the valley, and some are meant for the peak. My cousin has always been a valley man. He likes the shade. He likes the quiet. And while we might wish he had a bit more ambition, we have to celebrate him for what he is." He raised his glass, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the senator sitting at the end of the table, making sure his humility was being recorded by the right people. "To Alex," Julian toasted. May his life be as simple and uncomplicated as this wedding. The ring hit the crystal glass. I drank my water. I felt the weight of the billfold in my pocket, containing the master keycard that opened every door in this five-star fortress. I thought about the clawback clause in the Resort's hospitality contractor clause I had inserted myself during the acquisition. It allowed the owner to terminate any guest stay, without notice or refund, for behavioral inconsistencies or disruptions to the peace. Julian thought he was the guest of honor in a world he partially owned by right of his ego. He didn't realize he was a tenant on a very short lease. He spent the rest of the evening holding court in the lounge, telling the other guests about the massive deal he was closing on Monday, unaware that the lead investor on that deal was a holding company whose board of directors consisted of exactly one person, me. As the sun dipped below the ridge, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Julian walked over to me one last time. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a $20 bill, and pressed it into my palm with a patronizing wink. For the valet, Alex, I noticed the parking lot is getting crowded with some of the local hikers. Make sure my car is front and center. I have an early start tomorrow. Important people to see. Real world stuff. I looked down at the bill. I looked up at the mountains that now belonged to me, from the roots of the trees to the stars above the peaks. I'll make sure everything is handled. Julian, I said. My voice was a summer pondo. Ripples. No heat. Everything will be exactly where it belongs. That's the spirit, he said, turning away. Details, Alex. Details. I felt the deep, rhythmic satisfaction of a librarian closing a book that had been left open for far too long. The due date wasn't just coming. It was already here. The following week was a study in practiced cruelty. The summit of the mountain remained draped in a heavy, slate-gray mist that refused to burn off, even at noon. It felt as though the atmosphere was mimicking the tightening of a knot. Julian had not checked out. In fact, he had extended his stay by 4 days, turning the presidential suite into a makeshift war room for his waterfront deal. I watched him from the lobby, or sometimes from the shadowed corners of the library mezzanine. He moved through the resort with the entitlement of a conqueror. He barked orders at the concierge about the temperature of his espresso. He demanded that the mountain trails be closed for his private morning jog because he wouldn't think with the chatter of tourists. Every time a staff member hesitated, Julian would perform his signature move. He'd lean in, tilt his head, and let that signet ring sharp tap against the nearest marble surface. Alexander, he called out, spotting me near the grand stone fireplace. I was holding a leather-bound folio of the resort's original 1924 survey maps. He didn't walk to me. He whistled, a short, sharp sound usually reserved for a dog that's wandered too far from the porch. I walked over, my pace measured and slow. I had spent the morning reviewing the revenue shares. Julian's extension was costing him $3,000 a night. Money he was paying into a merchant account that bore my legal name. The Wi-Fi in the North Wing is abysmal. Julian snapped, not bothering with a greeting. I'm trying to move $500 million in equity, and I'm losing the connection every 20 minutes. I assumed that for the price I'm paying, this place would have industrial-grade infrastructure. But then again, I suppose I shouldn't expect much from a place he recommended. He brushed a speck of invisible lint off my shoulder. I've been thinking about your wedding gift. I've decided to buy out that little mortgage you have on your townhouse. It's embarrassing, really, having a sterling relation tied to a bank loan like a common clerk. Of course, the house will be put into a trust under my name for your protection. Naturally. You aren't great with details. That's a very significant gesture, Julian, I said. My heart didn't race. I felt only a cold, clinical detachment. He was trying to buy the last piece of my autonomy, wrapping it in the velvet of family support. It's what we do, he said, turning his attention to a group of investors who had just stepped off the elevator. Now, go find the manager. Tell him, if my connection drops again, I'll be calling the board of directors. I happen to know the previous owners personally. He didn't know the previous owners. He knew the men who had failed them. The symbolic betrayal happened that evening at the founders' dinner, an annual event the resort held for its legacy guests. Julian had insisted on a seat at the head table, and because the staff had been instructed to treat him with utmost care until I gave the word, they complied. Sarah and I were seated at a small table near the kitchen doors, the valley, as Julian had dubbed it. Halfway through the second course, Julian stood up to offer an impromptu speech. He wasn't on the program, but Julian never waited for an invitation to be the center of attention. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice booming across the timber-framed hall. I've spent the last few days enjoying this beautiful mountain. It reminds me of the Sterling philosophy, growth, elevation, and the shedding of the weak. He turned his gaze toward our table, a predatory glint in his eyes. My cousin, Alexander got married here last week. A very quiet affair. It made me realize that some people are content to simply exist in the scenery, while others are meant to own it. Alex, stand up for a moment. Would you? I didn't move. Sarah's knuckles were white as she gripped her water glass. Oh, don't be shy. Julian chuckled, the room joining him in a polite, confused titter. I was telling the mayor earlier, Cliff is the perfect example of why we need the Sterling Foundation. Without family to look after him, men like him would be lost in the shuffle. He's spent 30 years looking at old papers while I've been building the future. Tonight, I want to announce that the Sterling Group will be looking into revitalizing this very resort. It needs a firm hand. It needs vision. He then did the unthinkable. He pulled a small, silver bell from his pocket, a gift he'd bought at the gift shop, and rang it. Alex, since you know the staff so well, would you mind bringing the mayor another bottle of the 2012 Reserve? The waiter is occupied, and I'm sure you'd love to feel useful for once. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of 20 guests witnessing a public execution of dignity. Julian stood there, smiling, the bell glinting in the candlelight. He wasn't just mocking me. He was erasing me. He was telling the most influential people in the state that I was his servant, his project, his help. I stood up. Slowly, I felt the collective breath of the room hold. I walked toward the head table. Julian's smile widened, his head tilting to the left in anticipation of my compliance. I reached the table and picked up the empty bottle of wine. I didn't look at the mayor. I looked directly into Julian's pale blue eyes. You've always had a way with announcements, Julian, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. It wasn't shaking. It was the voice of a man reading a verdict. You speak about vision as if it's something you can buy at a boutique. But vision requires seeing what's right in front of you. Just the wine, Alex, Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, a warning tone. Don't try to be clever. It doesn't suit the suit. His ring hit the table with a sharp, final sound. Of course, I replied. I leaned in, as if to take his plate, and whispered just loud enough for the head table to hear. I hope you enjoy the presidential suite tonight, Julian. I've heard the views are quite different when you realize the ground beneath you has already shifted. I walked away. I didn't go to the cellar. I walked out of the dining hall, through the heavy oak doors, and into the cool night air. Sarah followed me out. We stood on the edge of the darkened veranda, the lights of the resort glowing behind us like a fading empire. Now, she asked. Not yet, I said. He needs to sleep in that bed one last time. He needs to feel the full weight of the Sterling name before it becomes a liability. I took out my phone and sent a single text message to the resort's chief of security and the head of finance. Execute the inconsistency clause for room 101. Effective 6 a.m. Prepared the final invoice, including the 1934 historical preservation surcharges. No exceptions. I looked back through the window. Julian was laughing, his hand on the mayor's shoulder, his signet ring flashing in the light. He believed he had won. He believed he had successfully performed the ultimate social erasure of his only rival for the family's moral standing. He didn't even know that I had spent the last 3 hours before dinner on a conference call with the board of the Waterfront project. I had presented them with the Penhaligon papers, the evidence of the Sterling family's original land theft. I didn't ask them to fire him. I simply showed them the risk. Investors don't care about morals, but they are terrified of litigation. By the time Julian finished his second glass of the 2012 Reserve, the multi-billion-dollar deal was already being quietly dismantled in offices 300 miles away. The betrayal was complete. He had stripped me of my dignity in front of his peers, and in doing so, he had confirmed every psychological profile I had built on him. He was a man who couldn't help but overeat. I looked at the $20 bill he had given me for the valet. I took a match from the railing, struck it, and watched the paper curl and blacken in the mountain breeze. Details, Julian, I whispered to the dark. They really are the only thing that matters. The night was quiet. The mist had finally cleared, revealing a sky so sharp and cold it looked like shattered glass. I felt a strange sense of mourning, not for Julian, but for the 20 years I had spent hoping he would be a better man. That hope was gone now. There was only the record. I went to my private office in the East Wing, a room Julian didn't even know existed. I pulled up the security feed. I watched him stagger slightly as he left the dining hall, buoyed by wine and the intoxicating high of his own perceived power. He looked small on the screen, a flickering ghost in a house that didn't want him anymore. I opened the ledger of his debts, the real ones, the ones that couldn't be paid with a check. I made a final note under the date. Public humiliation. Witnessed by 22. Status. Recognized. Response. Initiated. I closed the book. I felt the weight of the mountain beneath me, solid and unmoving. Julian had spent his life trying to climb it. He never realized that the mountain was listening. The weeks following the founder's dinner were characterized by a silence so profound it felt tactile. In the high-stakes world of the mountain resort, information is the only currency that doesn't devalue, and I had become the mint. Julian remained in the presidential suite, but the atmosphere around him had shifted from reverence to a localized low-pressure system of confusion. He still walked the halls with his chin tilted high, but the staff no longer scurried. They stood still, watching him pass with a clinical, detached curiosity. I, meanwhile, retreated into the shadows of the East Wing office. To the world, I was the grieving cousin-turned-valet who had been publicly humiliated. To the ledger, I was the architect of an invisible fortress. The strategy for a quiet revenge is not built on sudden movements. It is built on the steady, rhythmic application of pressure to the points where the antagonist is most brittle. For Julian, that was his obsession with the deal. The Waterfront development wasn't just a project, it was his identity. It was the physical manifestation of the sterling legacy he claimed to protect. I spent the first 14 days of Act 3 in a state of deliberate, paper-heavy isolation. I did not confront Julian. I did not answer his increasingly frantic text messages demanding an explanation for the Wi-Fi. I stayed in the archives, surrounded by the smell of Ingol ink and old leather. I was waiting for the paperwork to bloom. The point of no return realization came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 18 days after the dinner. I was reviewing the original 1934 Charter of the Mountain, the document Ezekiel Sterling had used to consolidate the local landholdings. Julian had always claimed the mountain was a gift from the state. The document told a different story. It was a lease, a 99-year lease, with a very specific, very overlooked performance clause. If the land was ever used for private gain that excluded the public interest, the lease would trigger an immediate reversion to a public trust. By building his private war room, by attempting to close the public trails for his morning jogs, and by hosting private investor meetings that utilized municipal resources without compensation, Julian hadn't just been arrogant. He had been legally negligent. He had triggered the reversion. I sat back in my chair, the light from the desk lamp spilling across the yellowed parchment. I felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity. The mountain wasn't just mine because I had bought the deed. It was mine because I was the only one who understood the rules of the house. I began the paperwork phase. This is the part of the story that most people find boring, but it is where the real power lies. It is the silent movement of assets, the filing of quiet liens, and the notification of regulatory bodies that operate on a timeline of months, not minutes. I reached out to the state's Historical Preservation Office. I didn't mention Julian by name. I simply provided them with the Penhaligon papers and a copy of the 1934 Charter. I suggested that a preliminary audit of site usage might be in order. I knew that once the bureaucracy started grinding, no amount of sterling charm could stop it. Time skipped. 3 weeks became 6. I watched Julian through the digital eyes of the resort's security system. He was starting to fray. The click of his ring against the mahogany tables was no longer a sound of dominance. It was a nervous tick. He was spending hours on his balcony, his phone pressed to his ear, his face growing paler with every call. The deal was dying. The investors had begun to ask questions about the sterling land titles. Julian, in his typical fashion, had tried to gaslight them. He told them the records were in transition, that his steward was handling the details. But the investors weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at the letters they were receiving from the state. I saw him in the lobby one afternoon. I was carrying a stack of files to the vault. He looked older. His designer suit seemed a fraction too large, as if the air was slowly leaking out of his reputation. "Alexander!" he barked, though the bark had a slight tremor. He didn't whistle this time. He walked toward me. "I've been looking for you. The bank is asking for a signature on the townhouse trust. They say the title is clouded." I stopped. I didn't put the files down. I looked at him with the same polite, blank expression I had used for 20 years. "I'm sure it's just a formality," Julian said. "Details." After all, he flinched at the use of his own word. He tilted his head, ready to correct me, but the movement was sluggish. "Don't be glib. I need that signature by 5 o'clock. My lawyers are saying there's a discrepancy in the family holdings. Some nonsense about a 1930s deed. I told them you'd probably misfiled it. You always were a bit sloppy with the back-end stuff." The ring hit the stone pillar. The sound was hollow. "I'll look into it," I said. "Look into it now," he snapped, his voice cracking. A few guests turned to look. Julian immediately straightened his tie, the mask of the influential cousin snapping back into place, though the edges were ragged. "Just handle it, Alex. I have enough on my plate." He turned and walked away. I watched his back. He didn't realize that the discrepancy wasn't a mistake. It was the truth. finally catching up to him. I spent that night in the library, drafting the notice of termination. This was the silent withdrawal of support. For decades, the library and, by extension, the archivists had provided the Sterlings with a veneer of intellectual and historical legitimacy. We had curated their image. We had organized their past to make it look like a straight line of progress. I began the process of in the archival world, this means removing items from a collection. I wasn't stealing the Sterling papers. I was returning them. I sent a formal notice to Julian's office that the library could no longer in good conscience house the family collection due to the unresolved legal status of the original donations. I was effectively stripping the Sterling name from the shelves. Without the library, Julian was just a man in an expensive suit with a mounting debt. Without the steward to maintain the myth began to dissolve. I felt a strange, heavy sense of distance. I was no longer a part of the family dynamic. I was an observer of a natural disaster. I watched the weather reports of the valley, noticing how the storms were getting closer. The point of no return was a small, quiet moment. I was sitting on the veranda at dawn, the same spot where he had given me the $20 bill. I had the master ledger open on my lap. I reached out and drew a single, clean line through the name Sterling at the top of the resort's owner-occupant list. I replaced it with a single word: Penhaligon. I wasn't doing this for the money. The money was just a scoreboard. I was doing it for the record. I was doing it because Maria Santos and Arthur Penhaligon had been erased by people who thought they were too important to follow the rules of the house. I thought about Julian's greatest fear, the loss of control. He believed that control was something you projected outward, a force of personality. He didn't understand that true control is internal. It is the ability to sit in a room alone and know exactly where every shadow is. I looked at my wedding ring. It caught the first ray of the sun. It was no longer an indictment. It was a symbol of a promise I had made to myself, that I would never again let a loud man tell me who I was. As the resort began to wake up, as the first smells of coffee and wood smoke drifted through the halls, I felt a profound sense of internal clarity. The strategy was no longer a plan, it was a reality. The pieces were all on the board, and I had already made the final move. Julian just didn't know the game had ended yet. I went down to the kitchen and asked the chef to prepare a very specific breakfast for the presidential suite. A simple, humble tray of dry toast and black coffee. No champagne, no silver service. "Is there a special occasion, Mr. Alexander?" the chef asked. "No," I replied. "Just a reminder that the day has started." I walked back to my office, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. I felt the mountain beneath me, ancient and indifferent. It didn't care about Sterlings or Penhaligons. It only cared about the truth of the stone. Julian's voice echoed from the hallway above. The muffled shout of frustration as he discovered his private phone line had been disconnected. I didn't smile. I just sat down at my desk and opened the next file. The change began not with a bang, but with a series of small, inconvenient silences. In a high-end resort, luxury is defined by the invisible machinery of service, the way a room is freshened while you at breakfast, the way your favorite vintage appears without you asking. When that machinery begins to grind, the silence becomes deafening. Julian was the first to feel the friction. He emerged from the presidential suite at 9 a.m., his face set in its usual mask of impatient importance. He reached for the elevator button, but the brass plate remained dark. Out of order. He huffed, a sharp intake of air that signaled his rising blood pressure, and took the stairs. When he reached the lobby, he didn't find the usual line of bowing staff. He found a quiet space where the fire in the hearth had been allowed to go out, leaving only the cold, gray scent of ash. He marched to the front desk, his signet ring already cocked like a weapon. "Where is the manager?" Julian demanded, his voice echoing too loudly in the empty hall. "My suite's climate control is locked at 64 degrees. My private line is dead." And I was served dry toast for breakfast. "Dry toast, Alexander. Do you have any idea how much I am paying for this stewardship?" I was standing behind the concierge desk, reviewing a stack of maintenance logs. I didn't look up immediately. I finished my notation, capped my fountain pen, and then met his eyes. "Good morning, Julian," I said calmly. "I'm afraid the resort is undergoing a series of mandatory structural audits. As for the manager, he is currently in a meeting with the state's Historical Preservation Office. They've raised some concerns about the usage of the presidential suite. It appears that operating a private equity firm out of a land-grant heritage site is a violation of the 1934 Charter." Julian froze. The head tilt started, but it was jerky, uncertain. "What are you talking about? Concerns? I am a Sterling. My family practically built these mountains. If there's a violation, I'll have it cleared with a phone call." "I'm sure you'll try," I replied. "But the lines are currently down for maintenance. It seems the infrastructure here is as old as the deeds. Julian, some things just can't sustain the weight of modern ambition. He hit the marble counter, but the sound didn't command the room this time. It sounded like a hollow knock on a coffin. Fix it, he hissed, leaning over the desk. I have the final signing for the Waterfront project at noon. I need high-speed access, and I need this lobby cleared of auditors. Do you understand me? Or have you finally lost the few brains Sarah let you keep? I understand perfectly, I said, stepping out from behind the desk. In fact, I've prepared a temporary workspace for you. Since the suite is technically under audit, we've moved your materials to the garden room. The garden room was a small glass-walled enclosure near the equipment sheds. It was beautiful, but it was isolated, and more importantly, it was the only room on the property that didn't have a lock on the door. It was a goldfish bowl. As Julian stormed toward the garden room, I watched the first ripples of his panic take hold. He wasn't used to friction. He was a man who had spent his life gliding over the surface of things. Now, for the first time, he was feeling the texture of the world beneath him. By noon, the confusion had turned into a localized collapse. Julian's deal was not just stalling. It was evaporating. Because they had withdrawn the stewardship of the Sterling records, the banks had frozen the escrow accounts. They needed proof of title, and the only person who could provide that proof, the archivist, was currently unavailable for comment. I spent the afternoon in the library, watching through the glass. Julian was pacing the garden room like a caged animal. The conversations were not going well. His investors, the men who had laughed with him at the founders' dinner, were a fickle breed. They didn't follow leaders. They followed safety. And Julian Sterling was no longer safe. The symbolic weight of the day was captured in a single moment, the arrival of the mail. For years, the Sterling mail was a mountain of invitations, accolades, and high-priority documents. Today, there was only one envelope for him. It was a formal notice of default from the very board he thought he controlled. I walked to the garden room and tapped on the glass. Julian spun around, his eyes bloodshot, his silk tie loosened for the first time in his life. "The mail, Julian," I said, sliding the envelope through the door. He snatched it, his hands trembling. He ripped it open, scanned the contents, and let out a sound that wasn't a shout or a cry, it was a wheeze. The sound of a lung collapsing. "They pulled out," he whispered, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. "The board. They cite reputational instability. They say the title to the Sterling land is in question. Alex, they can't do that. I'm the lead. I'm the name. Names change." "Julian," I said, "records don't." "You did this," he said, the realization finally breaking through the gaslighting he had practiced on himself. "You found something in those boxes? You've been sitting on it, waiting for this week. Why? Because I gave you $20. Because I made a joke at your wedding. You'd destroy a dynasty over a bruised ego." I looked at him, and for the first time in 20 years, I let the mask of the humble servant slip just enough for him to see the man beneath. "I didn't destroy anything, Julian. I just stopped maintaining the illusion. You destroyed the Sterling name the moment you started believing your own lies. I didn't sit on a secret. I sat on a debt. And as you've told me so many times, details matter. The detail you missed was that the mountain remembers everyone it's ever belonged to. It doesn't belong to the loudest person. It belongs to the one who keeps the record." He tried to hit the glass wall, but his signet ring slipped, leaving a long, ugly scratch across the surface. "I'll sue you," he snarled, though the threat had no teeth. "I'll have you in court for a decade. I'll make sure you never work in this industry again. I don't think you understand the situation, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill the glass room. "To sue me, you'd have to prove you have the standing. And to prove standing, you have to produce the deeds. The deeds that are currently being audited by the state. The deeds that Arthur Penhaligon described as stolen in his final diary entry." Julian's face went a strange, sickly shade of gray. The word Penhaligon was the final blow. It was the name that had been scrubbed from the history books. The name he thought had been buried under 90 years of Sterling philanthropy. "How?" he breathed. "I told you," I said, turning to leave. "I'm a librarian. I know where things are kept." I walked away, leaving him in his glass box. I didn't look back when I heard the sound of a chair being thrown, or the muffled screams of a man who had finally realized that the help was the one holding the keys to his prison. The rest of the afternoon was a masterclass in quiet distance. The resort staff, sensing the shift in the atmospheric pressure, began to refer to me as Mr. Alexander instead of Sir or Alex. They didn't ask questions. They just followed the new protocols. The presidential suite was locked. Julian's car was moved from the front circle to the overflow lot. His credit cards, tied to the Sterling corporate accounts that were now under internal review, began to decline one by one. He spent the evening in the lobby, sitting in a wing-back chair, staring at the cold fireplace. He looked like a man who had been shipwrecked in his own living room. People walked past him. The mayor, the senator, the very people who had toasted him the week before. They didn't look at him. In the world of the elite, failure is contagious, and Julian was now the ultimate carrier. I sat in the balcony above, Sarah beside me. We watched the scene in silence. "Do you feel sorry for him?" she asked. "I feel the weight of it," I replied. "Justice is a heavy thing, Sarah. It's not a celebration. It's a correction. It's the sound of a book finally closing." As the clock in the lobby struck 10, the chief of security approached Julian. He didn't use force. He didn't shout. He simply leaned in and spoke a few words. Julian stood up, his movements stiff and robotic. He walked toward the door, carrying nothing but his briefcase and the coat he had arrived in. He stopped at the threshold, looking back at the grand hall, the marble pillars, and the bronze plaque that bore his family name. He looked up toward the balcony, and for a split second, our eyes met. I didn't gloat. I didn't wave. I simply stood there, an observer of the inevitable. Julian turned and walked out into the night. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gavel. I looked down at the $20 bill I had kept in my pocket, the one he'd given the valet. I walked to the fireplace, knelt down, and placed it on the kindling. I struck a match. The flame took hold, the paper curling and turning to ash. I watched until the last spark died out. The mountain was quiet again. The silence wasn't a void. It was a completion. The record was straight. The debt was paid. And the steward was finally home. The fog did not lift the next morning. It clung to the mountainside like a shroud, turning the grand pillars of the resort into ghostly apparitions. I woke at 5 a.m., not out of anxiety, but because the rhythm of my life had finally aligned with the rhythm of the mountain. There was no click of a tongue to wake me, no sharp demand for coffee, no shadow of a man who viewed my existence as a clerical error. Julian had not gone far. He was found at 7 a.m. sitting in his car in the overflow lot, the battery dead from a night of keeping the heater running. He looked less like a fallen titan and more like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. When the security team, now acting under my direct instructions, approached him, he didn't fight. He asked for a glass of water and a phone that worked. I met him in the small library, the room where we had shared a humble wedding breakfast just a week prior. I had the Penhaligon papers laid out on the central table. Beside them sat the new deed for the resort and the legal notice from the Waterfront board. Julian entered the room, his gait heavy. He looked at the documents, then at me. For the first time in 20 years, he didn't tilt his head. He didn't adjust his tie. He simply sat down. "You're the owner," he said. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a man finally accepting the gravity of a fall. Not a manager, not a steward. "You bought the debt from the state trust 3 months ago. You've been my landlord this entire time." "Ownership is a legal term, Julian," I replied, sitting opposite him. I kept my hands folded on the table. I preferred to think of myself as the person who corrected the filing error. The sterlings were a 90-year-old typo. I simply erased the mistake. I pushed a single sheet of paper toward him. It was a summary of the clawback ordinance I had triggered. Because the Sterling family had occupied the land under a fraudulent 1934 lease. The state was not just taking the land back, they were back-billing the estate for 90 years of unauthorized usage at current market rates. "The total," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat, "is roughly $482 million. Give or take the interest accrued overnight." Julian stared at the number. He reached out to tap his ring against the table, but stopped. The habit was broken. "That's everything. The townhouse, the Hamptons estate, the foundations. It's all gone. We'll be in debt for 3 generations. "Not we, Julian," I corrected him gently. "The debt follows the Sterling name. My name, as of this morning, has been legally reverted to my maternal line. I am Alexander Penhaligon, and as the last living representative of the Penhaligon estate, I have filed a claim for the remaining assets as restitution for the 1932 forgery." The silence that followed was absolute. Julian looked around the room, the books he never read, the heritage he never understood, the man he never truly saw. He looked like he wanted to scream, but he had no breath left for it. "Why didn't you just leave me?" he whispered. "If you hated me this much, why stay for 20 years? "I didn't stay because I hated you, Julian. I stayed because I was waiting for the record to be complete. If I had left 10 years ago, you would have replaced me with another steward. You would have continued to build your towers on stolen land. I stayed to ensure that when the truth came out, there would be no one left to fix the filing." I stood up. The reveal was over. There was no shouting, no cinematic confession. just the quiet closing of a ledger. "The valet has moved your car to the gates," I said. "The battery has been jumped. Your personal items, the ones not purchased with sterling corporate funds, are in the trunk. The rest stays with the house." Julian stood up, his movements stiff. He looked at the signet ring on his finger, the gold crest of a family that, on paper, no longer existed. He slowly twisted it off and placed it on the table. It made a small, pathetic tink sound against the wood. "Details, Alex," he said, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. It was the saddest thing I had ever seen. "Details, Julian," I agreed. I watched from the window as he drove down the mountain. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The mountain was no longer his to look at. Sarah came into the room a few minutes later. She looked at the ring on the table, then at me. "Is it finished?" she asked. "The record is complete," I said. "But the silence, that's just beginning." We walked out onto the veranda. The fog was finally breaking, revealing the valley below. It was a long way down, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the height. I wasn't standing on Julian's shoulders anymore. I was standing on the truth. The resort would remain open, but under a new name. The sterling memorial plaque in the lobby would be melted down. In its place, we would install a simple list of names: Maria Santos, Arthur Penhaligon, and the dozens of others who had been managed out of existence. Justice, I realized, doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like a long, deep breath after being underwater for a lifetime. It is the restoration of equilibrium. As I watched the sun finally hit the valley floor, I thought about the $20 bill I had burned. It was a small price to pay for the clarity I felt now. Julian thought money was power. He thought reputation was a shield. He never understood that the only thing that lasts, the only thing that truly survives the fog, is the truth of the record. I am Alexander Penhaligon. I am a librarian, an archivist, and the owner of a mountain. But mostly, I am a man who knows how to wait. The transition from a life of quiet observation to one of total ownership is not the explosion of light most imagine it to be. Instead, it is the deepening of the silence. In the weeks after Julian drove down the mountain for the last time, the resort did not celebrate. There were no banners, no grand speeches. There was only the sound of 1,400 keys being recut, and the heavy rhythmic thud of a bronze nameplate being pried from the marble wall in the foyer. I spent my first month as the undisputed master of the house, doing exactly what I had done for the previous 20 years. I worked, but I no longer worked for the preservation of a lie. I worked for the restoration of a ledger. The sterling brand did not die a quick death. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution, because it had successfully reclaimed the Penhaligon estate through the clawback ordinance. The family's liquidity evaporated overnight. The Hamptons estate was seized by the state to cover the unpaid historical usage fees. The townhouse, the one Julian had so arrogantly offered to put in a trust for my protection, was sold at auction. I didn't buy it. I didn't want the ghosts of his condescension following me. I let a young family buy it, people who would fill the rooms with laughter instead of the sharp clack of a signet ring against mahogany. One rainy Tuesday in November, a letter arrived at the resort. It wasn't in a designer envelope. It was a standard, government-issued packet from the state penitentiary's legal aid office. Julian had been indicted on 3 counts of securities fraud and 1 count of criminal forgery related to the Waterfront project. He wasn't in a jail cell yet. He was out on a bail he couldn't afford, staying in a mid-tier motel near the city's industrial district. The letter was from his lawyer, a man who sounded tired even through the ink on the page. Julian was requesting a meeting, not a confrontation. The lawyer was careful to specify a clarification. I didn't answer for 3 days. I walked the mountain trails Sarah and I had once been permitted to use. I looked at the trees, the ancient oaks that had seen the Penhaligons, the Sterlings, and now, the return. They didn't care about the names. They only cared about the soil. On the 4th day, I agreed to meet him, not at the resort, and not at his lawyer's office. I met him at the public library, the small, local branch where I had spent my Saturday mornings as a child. Long before I became a steward for the elite, Julian was already there when I arrived. He was sitting at a scratched wooden table in the back, surrounded by the smell of damp coats and old newspapers. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a generic fleece jacket and a pair of jeans that didn't fit him right. Without the armor of his wealth, he looked startlingly ordinary. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life pretending to be a giant, only to realize the floor was made of glass. "Alexander," he said. He started to reach for his tie, a phantom limb reflex, before remembering he wasn't wearing one. His hands were bare. The signet ring was gone, replaced by a pale, indented circle of skin that would likely never fade. "Julian," I replied, sitting across from him. I didn't offer to buy him coffee. I didn't ask how he was. I simply waited. "I'm not here to ask for the money back," he said, his voice stripped of its operatic resonance. It was thin, like paper. "I know it's gone. My lawyers explained the math. You didn't just take the resort. You took the last 90 years of interest. I'm an old man with a negative net worth. You're a man with a corrected record, Julian," I said. "The math was always there. You just chose not to read the footnotes." He looked at me for a long time, his pale blue eyes searching for a crack in my composure. He was looking for the humble servant he could manipulate, the man who would feel guilty for winning. He didn't find him. "I wanted to ask about the diary," he said. "Arthur Penhaligon. Was he really my great-grandfather's friend?" "He was his partner," I said. "Until your great-grandfather realized that a partnership requires sharing the glory. Elias wanted the mountain to be a monument to one man, not two. So he turned Arthur into a ghost. He used the law to erase a man's life." "And you did the same to me," Julian whispered. "No," I corrected him. "I used the law to find him. You were erased by the truth you tried to hide behind. There's a difference." Julian leaned forward, his voice dropping to a desperate, ragged hiss. "I did love you, Alex. In my way. I thought we were a team. I thought I was protecting you from a world that would have eaten you alive. You weren't protecting me, Julian. You were hoarding me. You wanted a witness to your greatness who was too quiet to contradict you. You didn't love me. You loved the reflection of yourself you saw in my silence." He flinched. The habit returned for a split second. He tilted his head to the left, but then he caught himself. He slumped back into the plastic chair. The silence between us wasn't the comfortable quiet of a library. It was the cold, heavy silence of a tomb. "What now?" he asked. "For you, I mean, you have the mountain. You have the money. You have the respect you were so obsessed with. Are you happy?" I thought about the question. I thought about the 20 years of my youth that were gone. I thought about Sarah, who is currently at the resort, organizing a scholarship fund for local students. The kind of real-world stuff Julian used to mock. "Justice isn't the same as happiness, Julian," I said, standing up. "And vindication isn't the same as peace. But I am no longer looking for your permission to exist. That is enough for me." I walked away from the table. I didn't look back. As I reached the door of the library, I heard a faint, rhythmic sound. I turned, just for a second. Julian was tapping a plastic pen against the wooden table. It was a hollow, desperate imitation of his old power. He was a man trying to cast a shadow in a room with no light. I walked out into the autumn air. The fog had lifted, revealing a sky of brilliant, piercing blue. The aftermath was not a storybook ending. The resort's transition was difficult. We faced lawsuits from the other Sterling relatives, people who had lived off the theft for decades and felt entitled to the spoils. I spent a year in depositions, answering questions with the same clinical precision I used for the archives. I didn't lose a single case. You cannot argue with a primary source document. The Sterling name eventually faded from the public consciousness. The Waterfront project was completed by a consortium of local businesses, and it was named the Penhaligon Pier. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a functional, public space where families could walk and look at the water. Respect was redefined. It was no longer something I waited for Julian to grant me. It was something I carried in the way I spoke to the staff, the way I managed the land, and the way I lived my life. I remained quiet. I remained observant. But I was no longer a ghost. One evening, a year after the reveal, I found the $20 bill Julian had given me. Or rather, I found the charred remains of it in the fireplace of the small library. I picked up a small piece of the blackened ash. It crumbled to nothing between my fingers. Sarah walked in, carrying a tray of tea. She saw me looking at the hearth, thinking about the past. She asked. "Just checking the records," I replied. We sat on the veranda as the sun set. The mountain was orange and gold, a cathedral of light. The silence here was different now. It wasn't a held breath. It was a release. I am Alexander Penhaligon. I am a husband, an archivist, and a man who knows that some truths don't need witness eyes. They just need a record. The ledger is closed. The debt is paid. And for the first time in my life, I don't have to wait for the due date. It is already here. The Sterling family legacy was built on a lie that lasted 90 years. Alexander spent 20 years in the shadows to prove that time is the librarian's greatest ally. As we look at the empty foyer where the Sterling name once hung, we are left with one final question for the record. Is the man who waits 20 years for justice a patient hero? Or has he become a different kind of monster by allowing the lie to live so long? They finally understood. In the end, I didn't explain further. Some truths don't need witnesses.